Hi there, I'm JD Maher. Welcome to Shalom World's 500 YOC program in partnership with the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines. In this series, we dive deep into 500 years of Christianity, its roots, journey, and fruit in the world's third largest Catholic country, the Philippines.
In the 16th century, explorer Ferdinand Magellan and his team of voyagers from Europe reached the island of Cebu to expand their spice trade. This has been marked as a milestone in the history of the country and its people. The Christian missionaries who accompanied Magellan on the Spanish ship spread the gospel in the Philippines.
Missionaries from the world's major religious congregations have played a significant role in the spread of Christianity throughout the Philippines, and their remarkable endeavors have helped shape its culture. One of their greatest contributions to Philippine society is the Catholic educational system, which has had a long history and has given rise to many of the prominent educational institutions in the country. These schools and universities imparted to the Filipinos both knowledge and good values, which produced not only Filipino intellectuals, but also bright and able native clerics, as exemplified by the three martyred priests, Father Mariano Gomez, Father Jose Burgos, and Father Jacinto Zamora, popularly known as the Gomborza. The efforts of these priests and intellectuals have in turn helped stir up the Filipinos' sense of nationhood. This episode explores the work of religious missionaries in the Philippines, highlighting their contribution in the field of education and how this gave rise to brilliant Filipino clergymen who became instrumental in the birth of the country's nationhood. On this episode of 500 YOC, we're honored to have with us Father Ateneo de Castro, S.J.
Father Ateneo de Castro, S.J., received his degree in philosophy at Ateneo de Manila University. In 1991, he obtained the degrees in Master of Arts in Theology and in Sacred Theology. He was ordained to the priesthood in March 1992 and shortly after was sent to the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome for his licentiate and doctorate in church history. Father Ateneo was the Associate Professor of Church History at the Loyola School of Theology for almost 20 years, where he taught courses in philosophy, theology, and history at the Ateneo de Manila University. He was the series editor of the Mindanao Studies publications of the Ateneo de Manila University Press for some time and has contributed chapters to books such as Theology, Conflict, and Peace Building in 2019 and Philippine Local Churches After the Spanish Regime in 2015. Father Ateneo is currently the Associate Professor of History at the School of Liberal Arts of Ateneo de Zamboanga University.
Welcome, Father Ateneo de Castro, to 500 YOC. We're glad you're with us.
Thank you, JD. I am happy to be here with you.
Father Ateneo, one of the most important historical indicators of the success of evangelization seems to be the establishment of local churches. And the most significant indicator of a local church is that development of the native clergy. Now, based on my research, it seems that there were long delays in the development of the native clergy in the Philippines. What would you say were the reasons for those long delays?
When we talk about the development of a native clergy for a local church, which in many ways is the most important sign that that local church has kind of matured, no? Has reached a certain level of development, because a local church has to be able to sustain itself, to provide for its own needs, and no longer dependent precisely on missionaries to evangelize the people, to provide catechesis and things like that. Okay, what that means, first of all, is that the time is of the essence, right? So actually, just on a practical level, you need several generations, as it were, to fully kind of be to fully produce, you might say, a youth or a group of people who would then be ready to take on, as it were, the rigorous training that usually accompanies formation of candidates to the priesthood. So, just on that practical level, therefore, there is a need for time. The second thing would be this. I mean, we are talking of a post-Tridentine situation here. The Council of Trent had set up, you might say, rather important standards, as it were, for the reform of the clergy, right? That's when the seminary system was born, for example, and people had to learn Latin. That was a requirement. And of course, in the Philippines, they also had to learn Spanish. No? So again, the idea of the reformed priest given to us by the Council of Trent would therefore require that candidates to the priesthood be particularly well prepared. Now, the problem with the Philippines, I guess, is that it became caught up, as it were, in certain decisions made in Mexico and in Peru, where initially there was an experiment to try to form boys, you might say, young people for the priesthood. And those experiments ended in failure, mainly because there was no sufficient time, as it were, given for the maturation of the people, so that then the vocations to the priesthood could be nurtured, could be developed, could be brought to fruition, etc. At some point, inertia would set in. It's just as more and more missionaries were coming in from Spain through Mexico, it became less and less necessary, as it were, to try to develop native vocations. Okay? And therefore, in the beginning of the 18th century, there would be a much more concerted effort, as it were, to develop a native clergy. So that by the middle of the 18th century, around the 1750s, the Archdiocese of Manila, for example, which covered quite a huge area, would have about 50% of its secular priests as native or mestizo. So that's it was a slow growth, slow movement, but by the end of the 1800s, certainly you would have precisely maybe about 700, 800 plus native clergy, secular clergy in the Philippines. So this is the other thing that we need to remember. The religious orders then in the Philippines did not accept native vocations, but the secular clergy, yes. And for many reasons, you would have the development of the native clergy as perhaps the last indicator of a church that has matured. It had to go through a long process of maturation, okay, involving twists and turns, also in the political area, because we have to understand that during this time, missionary work in the Philippines was totally under the auspices of the Spanish monarchy. Huh? So that system we call the Patronato Real de la Iglesia de las Indias was an arrangement entered into by the Pope and the King of Spain. And in that arrangement, the King of Spain basically is given the responsibility for the evangelization of all the people that come under her jurisdiction. No? So basically, then we also have to recognize that it was because of the Spanish king's solicitude, if you wish, for the people of the Philippines, colonized by the Spaniards, okay, but nevertheless, with initially certainly with a genuine concern for evangelization, like Philip II. Then you would have this commitment, as it were, on the part of the Spanish monarchs to provide missionaries, to build churches, to build schools, at some point to appoint bishops for the local church in the Philippines.
I'm so impressed with your wealth of knowledge. You're like a walking timeline of the history of the clergy. It's very impressive. And in my studies, I came up with what we call the secularization of the parishes controversy. And that was one of those seed beds for the birth and growth of a Filipino national consciousness. What would you say would be the relationship between the controversy and the unfortunate execution of Father Jose Burgos and Father Mariano Gomez and Father Jacinto Zamora, the so-called Gumborza? What's the connection there?
The ordinary practice of the church is that once a mission becomes sustainable, once it is able to support itself, then the missionary, usually a religious, is supposed to move somewhere else, is supposed to go to another place. And the secular clergy are now supposed to come in and take over the parish. Okay? In fact, we can look at the development here from mission to parish. Okay? Once you say parish, we're basically talking of a canonical term that means that the local community here is now able to sustain itself, support itself, keep its parish priest alive, provide for his needs, maybe even have a school, all the other things, provide catechesis, and today perhaps we would say maybe even social programs and all of those things. Now, because of the patronato, here is the thing, when the work of the church, in a sense, gets entangled with political questions, okay, the problem is as more and more Indios, okay, and we would say Filipinos, basically, let's just say Filipinos, enter the priesthood, obviously, the missions before would now become parishes, right? See, in the 1590s, I would imagine the 1590s, the Spanish king, I think it was still Philip II, divided the country into areas of jurisdiction, as it were. Okay, like the Dominicans would take responsibility for one part of the country, the Jesuits one part, Franciscans one part, etc. Now, at some point, you would imagine, perhaps in the 18th century, the 1700s, so the Archdiocese of Manila, 50%, you might say, of the parish priests were mainly the secular clergy, who would be Indio, Criollo, and Mestizo. What we have here is the religious orders kind of holding on to what used to be missions but are now practically parishes. Okay, so and this gets entangled with what happened in Latin America because in the late 1700s, due to the influence of the French Revolution, the countries, you might say, the Spanish colonies in Latin America were slowly kind of freeing themselves from Spanish rule. And some of the leaders of those revolutions breaking out in the continent there, some of them were secular priests. Okay? So this is why some kind of political suspicion would now be cast over the native clergy or the Filipino clergy, the Spanish colonial government, and also the Spanish the home country in Spain. They were afraid of that thing being replicated in the Philippines. So slowly but surely, because initially there was in fact a policy of transferring the parishes now to the administration of the secular priest, as it should be, as was the common practice of the church. But because of all of these political fears and anxieties, etc., a reversal of that policy would be made, and not only a reversal, but now the transfer of parishes that were established themselves by the secular priests would now be effected, so that now Parishes that had been with a secular priest would be given to the members of the religious orders. Okay, and this is what would set people like Father Pelaez and Father Burgos precisely, and Father Gomez. Okay, this became the fight of their lives to have the secular clergy recognized. Okay, in the church and by the state, the dignity, as it were, of the native secular clergy to run the parishes, and therefore, you might say, they would then enter into a kind of conflict now with members of the religious orders who themselves were as well victims of this system, which continued to exist all the way to the end of Spanish rule. I've always asked myself as a historian, why is it that the patronato had to last all the way to the very end of Spanish rule when it was an arrangement made for a particular period in time? It had perhaps its own uses and advantages, but certainly by the 19th century, it should have been abrogated. But there's that thing about inertia as well, when the church is not able, as it were, to read the signs of the times, right? And therefore fail to move. Rome should have taken control of the church in the Philippines, but it continued to be under the Spanish monarch all the way up to 1898. The Treaty of Paris that transferred responsibility from the Spaniards to the Americans of the Philippines, that would be the end of the patronato, and only therefore in the beginning of the 1900s would Rome be finally be in charge.
I have to tell you, I'm absolutely amazed at our discussion and the information. I feel like I'm a student in an amazing Filipino clergy Catholic history class. I'm so impressed.
Are you looking for life-changing entertainment? Does what you see on most channels leave you feeling unfulfilled? Well, look no further. Shalom World TV brings the peace and joy of Jesus Christ to you, whether at home or on the go. To start watching, you don't need antennas, cable connections, or a dish. You probably already have what you need if you have a smart TV, such as a Samsung, LG, or Panasonic, or if you have one with an Android, Opera, or Roku TV operating system. These can be found on the latest models of Sony, Toshiba, Vizio, Philips, RCA, Sharp Aquos, TCL, Insignia, Element, Hitachi, Vestel, Skyworth, Changhong, Konka, and Hisense. You can also watch Shalom TV on most IPTV streaming devices, starting with the 4th generation of Apple TV and Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Mi Box, Amino, Humax, or on TiVo Box through the Opera TV store. Are you a gamer or virtual reality enthusiast? We've got you covered. Shalom World is on Xbox One, Razer Forge, Nvidia Shield, and HoloLens. To start watching, all you have to do is go to the App Store, download Shalom World, and start being fulfilled by content that brings you into a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. For more information on how to watch Shalom World on your TVs and devices, visit us at shalomworld.org/connectedtv. Have a smartphone or tablet? Take Shalom with you wherever you go. Again, by downloading Shalom World from the App Store. If you prefer to watch from your Mac or PC, get the Shalom World desktop app. Or you can always watch from our website, shalomworld.org. And guess what? Shalom World is absolutely free on all of these platforms. Yes, free. There are no download charges and no in-store app purchases required, ever. If you're looking for life-changing entertainment, you found it. It's here, waiting for you on your Shalom World.
Father Antonio, there have been very few attempts to formulate what we call a theology of nationality. The universality of the church has often been very suspicious of an extreme nationalism that divides people and races between and among themselves. So, with that in mind, what could be some of the elements of such a theology?
Benedict Anderson, he was a professor at Cornell University. He had written a book on imagined communities. He says the nation is an imagined community constructed historically. It's not something that falls from heaven, but is made, as it were. Okay? And he says scholars of nationalism have said very often they find three paradoxes about nationalism and the idea of the nation and the nation state. We're still kind of today, I think, under the spell of the ideology of the nation state. But he says, and one of the paradoxes pointed out was that he says, the thing about nationalism is that it's a politically powerful sentiment. Okay, it's powerful. Okay? Today, I guess we can see it in context where perhaps it's legitimate. Like today, we would say that the Ukrainian people, for example, have the right to defend themselves, right? Their nation, as it were. Okay? But somebody also said that nationalism is very often the last refuge of scoundrels. Okay. Raise the nationalist flag and everybody will come gather around you, no? Even if they're criminals and etc. Okay, so he says is the political power of nationalism, but then he says the philosophical, and I would add perhaps theological impoverishment of nationalism, because human rights, for example, are based on our being human. Okay. Not on our belonging to a particular nation. In fact, human rights transcends nations. And I also like to point out to my students that the church is a universal community. Okay? It is not tied to any nation, right? And that was the problem, I guess, we found in centuries past when the faith, as it were, gets kind of too entangled with a particular political formation, etc., particular ideology, etc. So sometimes sometimes it's understandable the way it developed at that time, but if it continues to the present, where we have perhaps greater, deeper insight about such things, then the church can suffer. No? The church can become widowed in the next political system. No? So in any case, but I do like to tell my students that what nation does, if you connect nation with culture, then I think you can have, you might say, the idea of a nation as some kind of a spice. It adds color. It gives shape. It introduces festivity. It introduces many things. The concrete manifestations of the faith in our cultures, then perhaps life would be rather so boring and so bland. So although, therefore, nationalism or the nation itself does not add anything to our being human in terms of our human rights, but nevertheless, our being human is lived through our belonging to a particular nation. Okay. Recognizing, of course, that the nation is also, as Benedict Anderson himself would admit, is also limited. Okay, something is beyond the nation, the fact of other nations, okay, the community of nations, and I guess it's pretty clear to us today how precisely I think the church, the Pope, for example, now plays a world leadership role, right? Because of the church as being not just international, but really a universal community, right? Catholics everywhere living their faith in their own nations with their own colors and shapes and flavors and figures, etc. And yet somehow belonging to the one church of Jesus Christ, sharing the same sacraments, having the same structure of the episcopacy, etc., but of lay people now also beginning to contribute, as it were, to the life of the church as a whole. That's where we're moving in the future.
Well, we have certainly learned a lot about the mission, education, nationhood of the Philippine Church. I feel like I've been in a master's class of the clergy. Thank you so much, Father Ateneo de Castro. We appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very happy to participate in this grand effort.
Don't forget to join us again for more of the 500 YOC. Download that free Shalom World app to watch the series, get more updates on 500 years of celebrations in the Philippines, and many more amazing shows. I'm JD Maher. Mabuhay and Shalom.
We are you searching for fulfillment? Discover true happiness. Stay tuned to Shalom World.